Glenn Loury here. This is the Glenn Show. We're the black guys at bloggingheads.tv. But I got to come back to ground zero, Charles. Do you think black people are inferior genetically?
No.
Okay, well.
I'm laughing because that's such a silly question.
Tell me why it's a silly question, because that's a question that a lot of people are going to be asking me when they ask me, why did you have that guy on? He thinks black people are inferior.
Okay. Shall I unpack my answer a little bit?
Sure.
Okay. Are there genetic differences among people who self-identify as different ethnicities? Yes. The most clear differences are at the continental level, you know, East Asia, Europe, Sub-Saharan Africa, and so forth. Are these genetic differences to be expected? Yes, absolutely. Somebody put it this way. He said, the chances that different groups that are separated geographically would have evolved exactly the same is about the same as the chance of dropping a handful of silver dollars and they all land on their edge. You know, that's just not the way it works. If you have geographic boundaries, if you have other kinds of boundaries, and you're talking about tens of thousands of years, there is a lot of room for evolution to have taken place. And by the way, I'll just give you a little more background. Sorry, I love to talk about this because it's fascinating, all right? But also people have a very wrong impression. People, Stephen Jay Gould was famous for this, said the races can't be different because we only dispersed out of Africa 65,000 years ago or whatever. And evolution by mutation just takes forever. There hasn't been time for major differences to occur. And at the time he made that point in the 1980s, that was a respectable way to look at it. Subsequently, especially after the sequencing of the genome, we've learned that you can get much more rapid evolution than that through the variation that is called standing variation. Okay, I won't go any further into that. Mm-hmm. I will simply say point number one is it's certainly true, and we already know it's true, that there are lots of population differences in various genetic variants. That is not a controversial statement among geneticists. Do we know what effects those have on a variety of traits? Not very much. Are we learning a lot more as time goes on? Yes, we are. Are these differences going to prove to be scary? No, they won't. There will be differences. They will be usually moderate or modest, and they all involve overlapping distributions. And Glenn, I swear, I am amazed by how otherwise intelligent people have such a hard time grasping the concept of overlapping distributions, which is to say you've got two bell curves, to coin a phrase, and they overlap. Millions of blacks are smarter than millions of whites, despite the existing difference in cognitive scores. And by the way, millions of whites are better coordinated than millions of blacks, despite the black dominance in major sports. So yes, you have differences between groups. They do not determine your fate. They don't lend themselves to superiority, inferiority, because they're bundles. If you think of the bundle of characteristics you have, you know of a whole bunch of things about you personally that are above average and below average and somewhere near the average, whether we are talking about beauty or charm or industriousness or whatever they are. You have this very complicated set of attributes. And the idea of saying you can say one of these set of attributes is superior and the other is inferior is just an abuse of the language.
Okay, let me stop you because there's a lot on the table. I want to try to summarize. So we're talking about populations, not about individuals.
Right.
The claim that populations which have descended from ancestors who were isolated from one another for long periods of time could have distributions of genetically determined traits that are different from one another is an uncontroversial, almost self-evident claim.
Mm-hmm.
That needn't be a big deal.
Right.
It certainly needn't be saying that any population is inferior, because there's not one trait. There's a lot of different kinds of traits which are differently distributed between these population groups, and they will manifest with different dimensions of human performance, because human performance isn't one thing. So far, so good. But here's the thing that I keep thinking about. Right tail selection, the prestige, and we live in a world where this stuff gets communicated so quickly. So people who are outstanding performers, who are in the professional sports, who are at the top of some intellectual thing, who are, innovators in some hard area of study or human activity, are going to be selected from way out here. And if I have two populations, they might, with overlapping curves, they might differ modestly at the mean, but the relative numbers that are way, way, way out there could be differing by quite a bit.
Yeah.
And that could drive the conversation.
Yep.
Not enough Black professors of economics. Well, let me not pat myself on the back, but I'll just report, this stuff is hard, guys. This stuff is very demanding. You want to get a PhD in economics, you had better be really, really sharp at the kind of stuff that economists do. I'm sure the same thing is true about philosophy, about English literature, and many other fields. And so we're looking for proportionality in the representation of professors of economics. I give that as one example. And we're operating against a backdrop where, according to Murray, the populations in question differ at the mean with respect to one of the traits. This is going to be your G factor intelligence trait that's really important to being effective as a professor of economics. And so it's unreasonable, it's unrealistic to expect that there would be racial proportionality there. And if you insist on it, you're going to get tyranny, because you're going to have to override the natural choices that people are making. And you're going to get resentment and quite possibly a lot of blowback and backlash from your insistence on something which is simply not feasible to accomplish if you maintain standards for everybody. Am I reading you? Am I reading you?
Yeah, and this plays out in all sorts of different ways. For those of you who are not mathematically oriented, what you just said about small differences in means can translate into big differences at the tails is statistically absolutely true. And so, well, here's an example of why you have to start thinking in terms of combinations of skills as opposed to any one dimension. If you're going to use the word inferior and superior, then whites better get used to the idea that they're inferior to East Asians, because the evidence is pretty clear that you have elevated visual-spatial skills, especially among East Asians. And visual-spatial skills are really, really important for operating at the extremes in STEM fields: science, technology, engineering, mathematics. Now there's a lot of argument at this point with whites, I think, being overrepresented and trying to make the argument, saying, well, yeah, the East Asians have elevated skills, but they don't have the same creativity and they don't have the same persistence and so forth that whites have. And so it's not the case that they are producing all these wonderful things the East Asians are that whites aren't producing. Well, I find it interesting that whites have discovered that that's important to take into account these other characteristics. But it's also true that there is a legitimate argument to be made that, well, whites with IQs of 150 and East Asians with IQs of 150 have somewhat different other qualities that are related to important life outcomes. And that's true. But that also means that you just can't focus on one thing. The second point to be made, however, there are lots of points to be made about this, about the extremes. The first is we are talking about the extreme. If you want to talk about a nation where people can live together and 99 out of 100 of them are at a point on the spectrum where it's not a problem, and you've got 1% where you've got these larger disparities, okay, how big a deal is that? If you're talking about the functioning of society. And here's where you cannot say one thing on this subject without having to say another thing. But here's where the importance of differences within that top percentile have so much impact on life outcomes. I use the example in the book because you say to yourself, suppose you're at the 99th percentile of IQ. What difference does it really make if you're at the 99.5th? And the analogy I use is in sports, male basketball ability.
Yeah.
Well, you know what? If you just have a measure of male basketball ability, probably every starter on every college basketball team in a major school in the country is in the 99th percentile.
Yeah, because 1% of the population is a very large number of people. Exactly.
Think of your high school and you had stars on your basketball team. How many of them went on to college? First team on the college. Sure. I know for my high school, I don't know if we ever had anybody. And the fact is, of course, college starters are all in the 99th percentile. So is LeBron James. Well, you know what? There is a huge difference within that top percentile. And the same is also true. Somebody at the 99th percentile of IQ is a smart person. Somebody at the 99.9th can do things that the person at the 99th percentile can't do. And so it's a very small chunk of the population. But if you're looking at who is on the staffs of the quantitative hedge funds in New York City, making zillions of dollars, they are overwhelmingly people who are out at the 99.9th percentile. And that being the case, given the differences in cognitive ability, that means they are Asians and they are whites overwhelmingly.
Well, a lot of them are Jewish, Charles.
Yeah, and a lot of them are Jewish. That you know what? Just the fact that you raise that is another reason for people who are listening to us to stop getting so excited about this. Because if you want to start saying that some groups are superior to other groups in different kinds of skills, you don't have whites versus blacks in this kind of calculus. You have all sorts of different groups. Guess what? It's quite possible the Parsi are the most intelligent on average of anybody in the world. A lot of you haven't even heard of Parsis.
I don't know who they are. Is that Iran?
It's a very small group that originally was Persian. They moved to India. Okay. They've been in a lot of separate Parsis. They're a very small group, but boy, do they have very high skill levels. All right. We are a long way from talking about white superiority in this conversation.
Yeah.
Look at all the different groups we've talked about that in some skills, some issues are at the top, others are closer to the bottom, but there's an awful lot of complexity in this.
Okay, so the answer to my question is no. Charles Murray does not believe that Black people are inferior. Moreover, he thinks it's a silly question, and I think he's explained adequately why.